So what's in Chapter 2? Naturally, Chapter 2 follows up on Chapter 1. Chapter 1 was we're all morally flawed. Chapter 2 is it's always been that way. It's not as though all of a sudden we're morally corrupt. There's always been moral corruption and there's always been moral goodness. So for Chapter 2, I have to start somewhere. So I start off with capitalism and the economic development within the United States. So we begin with Christopher Columbus coming to a new land. Christopher Columbus was a business person. He was a merchant. He got subsidized with boats by King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. And he was looking for gold, for gems and for gold. And he needed laborers. So he enslaved the Native Americans and a lot of them died. So I don't go too deep into that. I just point out that the founding of the nation, the founding of the continent, there's ethical issues and a lot of them are business related. I talk about Roanoke and the Jamestown settlements, which had to deal with land issues between Native Americans and people from Europe that were settling here. There's a nice section about Adam Smith. Adam Smith is one of the most misunderstood economists. Adam Smith was very upset about poverty, and he said the purpose of capitalism is to put an end to poverty. He saw a lot of poverty in Scotland. And so he wanted to do an end with that, and capitalism was this great experiment, and the beauty of it is that it's based upon freedom. So Smith said, instead of having regulated mercantilism, what would happen if instead of regulating the market forces and regulating labor and regulating laborers, we just let people make their own decisions and see what happens? And Smith said capitalism would survive and go do better than anything else because people were good. Smith had a very, very strong Protestant religious foundation in him and really believed that for the most part we're very good, and if we're bad you put the person in jail. So that's his whole idea on capitalism. So for capitalism to continue to succeed, people need to be very honest, they need to be very ethical, and we have to make sure that companies that cheat and break the law get punished. Next, talk about the Industrial Revolution and all the issues, fascinating issues in terms of small businesses becoming big businesses and having more responsibilities, and the railroads, and then the growth of government and its impact, and antitrust laws that were needed, and then labor issues. Early in American history, it was illegal to form a union. It wasn't until the late 1800s and early 1900s that it was okay to form a union. And even that, people died in order to get unions formed. And unions aren't perfect. Unions, the mafia is involved in the union every now and then. There's scamming going on with unions. There's no organization that's perfectly good or perfectly evil, but have mixtures of both. So I talk a little about that. Talk a little about wages. There's always the discussions, are CEOs overpaid? Talk about minimum wages and a living wage just being slightly higher than a minimum wage. And then talk about over time, there's an expansion of stakeholder rights. So initially we were only concerned about the right of whoever owned the company. But then there was employee rights, and then there was customer rights, and then there's environmental rights, and then there's animal rights. So over time, the concept of rights is expanded to more and more stakeholders. And that leads us to the current time, and I talk about the federal sentencing guideline that was created so that people can choose whether or not they want to do the best practices in business ethics. If they do the best practices in business ethics, and a citizen and an employee says embezzles money, you don't have to pay the whole fine if you're doing all the best practices. So that was a great change in history for the United States. A little discussion about the B Corporation. Hardly anybody has heard about them, but that's the next new phase. If your organization has a certain number of best practices, the government will give you a tax break. The federal government, it's not the law at the federal level, but it's now the law in Philadelphia, and a few cities are playing around with that type of a law. And then the chapter ends with my optimal ethics systems model. So that's the best practices of business ethics from hiring somebody to community engagement. And that takes us to the end of chapter 2.